The silhouette of Alcatraz Island rises from the frigid, churning waters of the San Francisco Bay like a jagged tooth of rusted iron and unforgiving stone. On a clear night, the inmates staring through the salt-crusted bars of their cells could see the shimmering lights of the city shoreline. A mere mile and a half away, they could hear the faint, haunting echoes of laughter from yacht parties and the rhythmic hum of a civilization that had discarded them. This proximity was the ultimate form of psychological torture, a constant, glittering reminder of a freedom that was geographically close, yet biologically impossible to reach. For nearly 30 years, this 12-acre outcrop of sandstone served as the final destination for America's most unredeemable souls, earning its legendary moniker, The Rock. The transition of Alcatraz from a Civil War-era military defense post into the ultimate federal penitentiary in 1934 was a calculated response to the explosive rise of organized crime during the Prohibition era. The United States Department of Justice needed a place that functioned not just as a cage, but as a deterrent, a symbol of the absolute power of the federal government. It was designed to be the prison of prisons, a high-tech fortress where the most violent, escape-prone, and high-profile criminals were sent when every other institution had failed to hold them. When a prisoner stepped off the ferry at the Alcatraz dock, they were stripped of their names and given a number, entering a world where the only certainty was the relentless wind. The architecture of the cell house was a masterpiece of industrial intimidation, featuring tool-resistant steel bars and elevated galleries, where armed guards monitored every movement with telescopic sights. Unlike other prisons of the time, Alcatraz operated on a philosophy of privileges, not rights. An inmate was entitled to food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention. Everything else, including work, library access, and family visits, had to be earned through absolute obedience. The most terrifying aspect of the early years was the rule of silence, a policy that forbade prisoners from speaking to one another for years on end, turning the cell block into a tomb of living ghosts. The natural environment of the San Francisco Bay acted as a secondary, even more lethal layer of security that no man-made wall could replicate. The water surrounding the island is a treacherous swirl of unpredictable currents, with temperatures that rarely rise above 12 degrees Celsius. Even the most Olympic-level swimmer would find their muscles seizing from hypothermia within minutes of immersion. To further discourage escape attempts, the prison administration cultivated a chilling myth that the bay was infested with man-eating great white sharks. While the sharks in the bay were actually harmless bottom feeders, the psychological dread of a toothy death kept many men from testing the currents. Entering the gateway to hell meant surrendering any hope of a future, as the administrative focus was entirely on containment rather than rehabilitation. The first warden, James A. Johnston, was a man of iron discipline who believed that the only way to control the worst of the worst was through a regime of total predictability. Every minute of a prisoner's day was accounted for, from the synchronized clatter of breakfast trays to the final, echoing lock check of the evening. This rigid atmosphere created a pressure cooker of resentment and despair, where the silence was occasionally broken by the screams of men who had finally succumbed to the crushing isolation of the Pacific fog. As the 1930s drew to a close, Alcatraz had successfully established itself as an impenetrable myth in the American consciousness, a place where the law finally caught up with the lawless. It was a dark mirror to the American dream, a fortress of despair floating in the middle of one of the world's most beautiful harbors. The gateway was open, and the legends of the underworld were being ferried across the water one by one, into a silence that was intended to be eternal. However, as the walls grew colder and the iron began to rust, the human spirit's desperate craving for the lights on the shore would eventually lead to a confrontation that the architects of the Rock never anticipated. The iron gates of Alcatraz did not just hold men. They held the living histories of America's most violent eras, housing a roster of inmates that read like a who's who of the criminal underworld. By the mid-1930s, the island had become the ultimate dumping ground for the celebrity gangsters who had once mocked the law during the Roaring '20s. The most famous resident to walk the tiered concrete of B-Block was undoubtedly Al Scarface Capone, the king of Chicago's bootlegging empire. When Capone arrived in 1934, He expected to buy his way into comfort as he had in other prisons, but the rock was built to break the man, not the bank. He was stripped of his silk suits, given the number 85, and forced to mop floors under the watchful eyes of guards who were immune to his bribes. Capone's time on the island was a slow, agonizing descent from power into a state of neurological decay. The syphilis he had contracted in his youth began to ravage his mind, and the man who once controlled a multi-million-dollar syndicate was reduced to a confused shadow playing a banjo in the prison band. His presence at Alcatraz signaled to the world that the era of the untouchable gangster was over. He was joined by George Machine Gun Kelly, a kidnapper and bank robber whose fierce reputation was largely a product of his wife's PR campaigns. In the silence of the rock, Kelly was a model prisoner, a man who realized that his bravado meant nothing when faced with the cold reality of a solitary cell and a life sentence. Perhaps the most enigmatic of all the residents was Robert Franklin Stroud, known to the world as the Birdman of Alcatraz. Unlike the glamorous mobsters, Stroud was a cold, antisocial killer who had murdered a guard at Leavenworth before being transferred to the island in 1942. Despite the popular cinematic image of him tending to canaries on the rock, the reality was much harsher. Stroud spent 17 years in deep isolation, much of it in the hospital wing or the D-block segregation unit. He was a brilliant but deeply disturbed man who channeled his energy into legal studies and writing, becoming a master of self-education while remaining a pariah among both the guards and his fellow inmates. The daily life of these residents of Shadow was governed by a monotony so profound it often led to what the prisoners called stir-crazy syndrome. The schedule was a relentless loop of bells. A bell to wake up, a bell to stand for count, a bell to march to the mess hall, and a bell to begin work in the industries. The mess hall was considered the most dangerous place on the island, where hundreds of the world's most violent men were gathered in one room with knives and forks. To counter this, the ceiling was equipped with tear gas canisters that could be triggered from a remote booth, a constant reminder that death or incapacitation was only a heartbeat away if a riot broke out. Within the social hierarchy of the cell block, a man's reputation was his only possession, yet the rule of silence made maintaining that reputation a feat of non-verbal communication. Inmates learned to speak out of the sides of their mouths and use the plumbing system to whisper through the pipes, creating a subterranean network of information. Those who could not handle the sensory deprivation were sent to the whole dark, unheated cells in D block, where they were stripped of their clothes and left in total darkness for days. It was a place where time ceased to exist, and the only sound was the thumping of one's own heart against the stone floor. As the years passed, the worst of the worst began to realize that Alcatraz was not just a prison. It was a psychological laboratory designed to prove the futility of resistance. The high-profile inmates who once commanded armies of thugs found themselves begging for the privilege of a library book or an extra hour of exercise in the yard. The Rock had successfully replaced their notoriety with a numbing anonymity. However, even in the heart of this silence, a new generation of inmates was arriving, men who were less interested in their past glory and more focused on a future that lay across the cold, gray waters of the bay. The legends of the 1930s were fading, making way for the desperate innovators who would eventually attempt the impossible. By the early 1960s, the unbreakable reputation of Alcatraz had begun to show its first microscopic fractures. The salt air and relentless Pacific humidity were eating away at the iron and concrete. But more importantly, a new breed of inmate was studying the prison's vulnerabilities with the cold precision of an engineer. At the center of this burgeoning conspiracy was Frank Morris, a man with an IQ in the top 2% of the population, and a history of escaping from nearly every institution that had tried to hold him. Alongside him were brothers John and Clarence Anglin, bank robbers from Georgia who had spent their youth swimming in the treacherous currents of Lake Michigan. Together, these three men would orchestrate the most sophisticated and debated prison break in the history of the modern world. The impossible escape was not a spontaneous act of desperation, but a meticulous, year-long siege against the very fabric of the prison. The conspirators realized that the utility corridor behind their cells, a narrow, darkened space filled with plumbing pipes, was the only path to the roof. However, The vent grills leading into this corridor were set in concrete that had grown brittle over decades of exposure to salt spray. Using nothing but discarded spoon handles, stolen drill bits, and a motor from a broken vacuum cleaner, the men spent months chipping away at the walls during the prison's music hour, when the cacophony of accordions and banjos drowned out the scraping of metal on stone. To mask their absence during the night, Morris and the Anglins turned to the arts, creating a deception that would haunt the FBI for decades. Using a mixture of soap, toothpaste, concrete dust, and toilet paper, they sculpted remarkably lifelike dummy heads. They stole hair from the prison barbershop to give the sculptures realistic scalps, and used flesh-toned paint from the hobby shop to mimic the pallor of a sleeping inmate. These decoys were placed in their beds, tucked under the blankets, in a way that would fool even the most veteran guard during the hourly head counts. It was a masterpiece of macabre theater, a silent performance that allowed the men to work in the shadows while their ghosts slept in the light. The logistical challenge of crossing the bay required a level of ingenuity that bordered on the miraculous. The team gathered over 50 standard-issue rubberized raincoats, which they meticulously cut and glued together using heat from the steam pipes to create a makeshift inflatable raft and life vests. They even constructed wooden paddles and a bellows-like tool made from an accordion to inflate the craft once they reached the water's edge. Every piece of equipment was hidden in a secret workshop they had established on the top level of the cell block, a blind spot in the guards' patrol route that became the birthplace of their freedom. On the night of the 11th of June, 1962, the plan reached its terminal velocity. After months of painstaking preparation, the holes in the back of their cells were finally large enough to crawl through. Morris and the Anglins squeezed into the utility corridor, leaving behind their dummy heads to stand watch over their empty cots. They climbed the maze of pipes to the roof, avoiding the sweeping searchlights that crisscrossed the island. Carrying their heavy rubberized bundle, they navigated the precarious heights of the prison, sliding down a kitchen vent pipe to reach the ground near the island's northeastern shore. As they stood at the edge of the water, the dark expanse of the San Francisco Bay stretched before them like a cold, liquid abyss. The lights of the city flickered in the distance, a mile and a half of lethal currents and bone-chilling fog standing between them and a new life. They inflated their raft, pushed off into the darkness, and vanished from the sight of the rock forever. When the morning whistle blew and the guards discovered the papier-mâché heads in the beds, the impossible escape became a reality that shattered the myth of Alcatraz. The hunt was on, but the three men had already stepped into the fog, leaving the world to wonder if they had found a shore or a watery grave. The silence of the bay on the night of the 11th of June 1962 was a deceptive mask for the lethal forces of nature. As Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers pushed their patchwork rubber raft into the black water, they were instantly at the mercy of the slot, a powerful, outgoing tide that funnels through the Golden Gate with the force of a mountain river. The water temperature was a bone-chilling 10 degrees Celsius, a thermal wall that triggers cold shock in seconds, paralyzing the lungs and seizing the muscles. To succeed, they didn't just have to paddle. They had to survive a liquid treadmill that was trying to sweep them out into the vast, unforgiving Pacific Ocean. Into the cold they went, three men on a raft made of raincoats and hope, disappearing into a thick finger of San Francisco fog. Back on the island, the dummy heads performed their final duty, staring blankly at the ceiling as guards walked the galleries every hour, clicking their flashlights over what they assumed were sleeping inmates. It wasn't until the morning whistle blew at 7:15 a.m. that the illusion shattered. A guard, frustrated that an inmate wouldn't wake up, reached through the bars to shake the man in the bed, only to have a hollow, papier-mâché head roll onto the floor and shatter. The sirens of Alcatraz began to wail, a sound of institutional panic that hadn't been heard in decades. The ensuing manhunt was the largest in the history of the Bay Area, a desperate scramble involving the FBI, the Coast Guard, and local police. Helicopters buzzed over the water like angry hornets, and cutters combed every inch of the shoreline from Angel Island to the Marin Headlands. They found remnants of the escape, a plastic-wrapped bundle of letters belonging to the Anglins, a handmade life vest washed up on a beach, and several wooden paddles. But of the men themselves, there was nothing. No bodies, no clothing, and no confirmed sightings. It was as if the fog had simply opened up and swallowed them whole, leaving the investigators to argue over a ghost story. The FBI's official stance, maintained for years, was that the trio had drowned, their bodies swept out to sea by the ebb tide. They pointed to the fact that the water was too cold for a mile-long swim and that the raft was too flimsy to withstand the heavy chop of the bay. Experts argued that without the proper thermal protection, the men would have succumbed to hypothermia within 20 minutes. Yet, no corpses ever surfaced. A statistical anomaly in a bay where most drowning victims eventually wash ashore. The lack of physical evidence created a vacuum that was quickly filled by theories of a successful landing and a life lived in the shadows of South America. Decades later, the case remains one of the greatest cold cases in American history, fueled by tantalizing clues that refuse to stay buried. In 2013, the San Francisco Police Department reportedly received a letter signed by a man claiming to be John Anglin, stating that they had all survived that night, though barely, and that Morris and Clarence had since passed away. Family members of the Anglins also produced a photograph from the 1970s of two men in Brazil who bore a striking resemblance to the fugitive brothers. These fragments of evidence suggest that the impossible escape might have actually been achieved, proving that the rock's greatest defense, the water, could be conquered by those with enough desperation and luck. Whether they died in the cold embrace of the bay or lived out their days as free men in a foreign land, the 1,962 escape dealt a terminal blow to the myth of Alcatraz. The aura of invincibility was gone, replaced by the embarrassing image of guards being fooled by toys and spoons. The island was no longer a symbol of absolute federal control. It was a crumbling relic that had been outsmarted by its own inhabitants. As the investigation stretched into years and then decades, the Into the Cold chapter of Alcatraz became its most enduring mystery. A story of three men who dared to bet their lives against the ocean and, perhaps, won. The seismic shock of the 1,962 escape did more than just leave unanswered questions. It dealt a terminal blow to the very existence of Alcatraz. Less than a year after Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers vanished into the fog, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy signed the order to close the prison forever on the 21st of March, 1963. The official reason was the staggering cost of operation. Transporting everything from fresh water to food to an island in the middle of a bay was 3 times more expensive than any mainland facility. Furthermore, the salt air had turned the impenetrable concrete into a crumbling mess, proving that the rock was literally disintegrating from the inside out. After the last inmates boarded the ferry and left the island behind, Alcatraz fell into a profound silence. The corridors that once echoed with the rhythmic boots of correctional officers were reclaimed by the whistling wind and the cries of seagulls. However, the island did not die. In 1969, it became the center of a different kind of struggle when a group of Indians of all tribes occupied the island for 19 months to demand indigenous rights. This occupation breathed a new political life into the ruins, transforming a symbol of federal incarceration into a landmark of resistance and civil liberty. Alcatraz was never no good for nobody. Frank Weatherman, the last prisoner to step off the island in 1963. In 1972, Alcatraz was officially transferred to the National Park Service as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. In a twist of historical irony, the place no one wanted to enter became one of the most popular tourist destinations on Earth. Millions of visitors now line up at Pier 33 inches San Francisco to step into the cramped 5 by 9 foot cells and listen to the haunting Doing Time audio tour. The rusted bars no longer inspire terror, but rather a deep, somber curiosity about the limits of human endurance and the history of American justice. The legacy of Alcatraz in popular culture remains an undeniable force. It has become the universal archetype for the inescapable prison, inspiring everything from Clint Eastwood's gritty escape from Alcatraz to the high-octane action of The Rock. The image of the solitary island amidst the churning gray waves is a permanent metaphor for absolute isolation and the unquenchable human thirst for freedom. While it may have been an administrative failure due to its high costs and security breaches, as a legend, Alcatraz is a resounding success, a place where reality and myth are so tightly interwoven they can never be separated. Today, standing on the recreation yard and looking toward the Golden Gate Bridge, one can still feel the bone-chilling bite of the San Francisco wind. The cracks in the walls and the peeling lead paint tell the story of an era when justice was enforced through stone and silence. Alcatraz is more than a historical site. It is a monument to the futility of man-made fortresses against the slow erosion of nature and the relentless ingenuity of the captive mind. It reminds us that no wall is high enough to keep a man from dreaming of the lights on the far shore. The ultimate fate of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers remains the 20th century's most beautiful mystery. If they survived, they defeated the world's most powerful law enforcement apparatus, with spoons and raincoats. If they perished, they found their freedom in the cold embrace of the Pacific. Either way, the rock remains a rusting, majestic phantom in the middle of the bay, waiting for the next generation to walk its silent halls and wonder about the secrets still hidden in the shadows.